Hello, this is Mayor Raz J. Baraka, and thank you for tuning in to EduTalk, where we will discuss incredible topics centered around our young people, about local control, community schools, our special needs population, creating curriculum and opportunities for young people to move forward from elementary school into careers or to universities. It is the opportunity for us to discuss our young people's creativity, their imagination, their ability to move our city forward. We need them in Newark, and we need the best educated, the most well-trained, incredibly courageous and imaginative young people coming out of our school system. And this show gives us an opportunity to engage those topics. Again, thank you for watching. God bless.
Welcome to EduTalk. I'm Antoinette Richardson, Chief Education Officer for Mayor Raz J. Baraka's Office of Comprehensive Community Education. Thank you for joining us today. With us today is Domingo Morel. Did I say your name correctly?
You did.
Yay!
You did.
So before we go on with the program, we're just going to stop briefly because for every EduTalk program, we have a fun fact. Fun fact means that you who are viewing the show have the opportunity to try to find the answer to a question that I'm going to throw out. And today's question, I admit, it's a little bit difficult. So listen. In 1995, when the state took over the Newark School District, it disbanded the Board of Education and appointed a 15-member advisory board. How long did the advisory board remain appointed and not elected? That's a hard one. So we're going to come back closer to the end of the program, and we're going to talk about what the answer to that question is. So I'm going to now tell you a little bit about Domingo. I am so happy that he's here with us today. Domingo is an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark. He is also an affiliate member of Global Urban Studies and the Center on Law in Inequality and Metropolitan Equity at Rutgers, Newark. His research program and teaching portfolio focus on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, education politics, and public policy. Specifically, his research explores the ways state policies help expand or diminish political inequality among historically marginalized populations. Dr. Morel's current research examines how the increasing presence of state governments in urban affairs after the 1960s has affected Black and Latino political empowerment in United States cities. In his book, Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, right here, okay, the book examines the political implications of state takeovers of local school districts for communities of color. He also has another book, Latino Mayors, Power and Political Change in the Post-Industrial City. Okay, so that book examines the rise of Latino mayors in the United States. In addition to his scholarship, Dr. Morel has years of experience of applied experience in political affairs and public policies. He's the co-founder of the Latino Policy Institute at Roger Williams University and past president of the Rhode Island Latino Political Action Committee. He received his PhD in political science from Brown University in 2014. So, viewers, as you see, we are going to have some deep conversation on EduTalk today. And, you know, our past shows have been educational and very relevant. Today, we're going to talk about some things that are going to really make you think, that may make some of us uncomfortable, but will give us food for conversation about how we move forward today in today's political reality. So Welcome, Domingo.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure. So, first, why did you choose Newark as your primary case study when you were doing your research and writing your book?
Well, this question about state takeovers, the puzzle. As a political scientist, we're always trying to look at research puzzles. It all kind of originated from a case in Central Falls, Rhode Island, which maybe we could talk a little bit about later on. But in what was happening in Central Falls, Rhode Island, was a little bit different than I think thought was happening across the country in terms of state takeovers. And so I said, I want to study state takeovers not only in Central Falls, but what's happening throughout the entire country. And since New Jersey was the first state to take over a school district in 1989, the Jersey City Schools, I just thought that New Jersey made a lot of sense to study. And if you're going to study New Jersey schools and takeovers, you can't not study Newark.
That's right.
And that's why Newark became the central part of my research. The largest city in New Jersey, takeover in 1995, but then Newark is also very similar to other cities that experience takeovers across the country, like the Detroits, Oaklands, Baltimores, and so forth. And so I thought that by looking at Newark, we might learn about takeovers, not just in the city of Newark, but more broadly across the country.
Thank you. And I think that's very important because what we went through in Newark with state takeover, a lot of times, even though we knew it was happening other places, we kind of felt isolated. Like this was just happening to us because we felt the impact. And it was really the students in the city who really became involved with students in other cities that really opened the eyes of many of the adults to what was happening in other places.
Exactly.
So we can't talk about state takeover in Newark and how we came out of it without talking about the role of the young people in our city.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the Newark Student Union. So we always, just always have to recognize that. So, and folks, we know that Newark just came out of state takeover. We are now finally in local control. But it's important to examine what happened and why it happened, because what we're looking at now is how not to ever let it happen again and what we have to do as a community. So we can't know what to do unless we look at what happened. And we're going to look at it today in a very different way than I think we've looked at it ever before in conversations that I've heard, at least lately. So in your book, Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, your analysis discusses the ways that centralization, and let me stop there. I'm just going to give like a kind of rough definition of centralization. Kind of when the folks who are the decision makers, such as the state, they're distant, they're removed, they're detached from the people that they're making the decisions about, such as the children and the parents of those children who are really affected by the decisions. So you examined how this centralization affected Black and Latino empowerment differently in state takeover school districts. How in Newark in particular, the 1995 state takeover of public schools had a negative effect on the Black community by disenfranchising the African American leadership that had gained power. And you also speak to the reality that the effect of state takeover was different for Newark's Latino community, where the state takeover, if you look at the numbers, actually led to increased participation on the school board. So is this dynamic of disenfranchising kind of an impact on one group and an empowering kind of an impact on another group? Is this unique to Newark? And this is where it would be helpful to me if you can talk about Central Falls, Rhode Island, the similarities and the differences in those two school districts and your findings.
Yeah. So again, going back to Central Falls. So Central Falls, small city in the state of Rhode Island, majority Latino population, and they experienced a takeover similar to Newark in the 1990s. At the time that Central Falls experienced the state takeover, although they had a significant Latino population, they didn't have any political empowerment. They didn't have representation at the school board level, at the city council level, and didn't have a Latino mayor. And the first sign of representation for Latinos in Central Falls came after the state took over the school district. And like Newark, the state abolished the elected school board, which was made up of all it was an all-white school board, abolished that school board and appointed a new one. And when they appointed a new one, they had Latino representation there, so it was the first time in the city's history. Now, political scientists, research has shown that before communities get African American majorities on the city council and then a mayor, it all first starts off with the school board. And this is consistent across the board. It's happened in Washington, D.C., again, it happened in St. Louis, it happens in Cleveland, happens everywhere. That before you get a political empowerment at the mayoral level or the city council level, it all starts at the school board. And so what I thought maybe in the city of Central Falls, did the state take over then when they abolished the all-white school board, appoint a new school board, and for the first time have Latino representation? Did that ignite the type of subsequent representation of Latinos in ways that we saw in other cities? And actually, that's what happened. That first they had Latino school board members, then they had Latino city council members, and then now they have a Latino mayor. And so it happened the same trajectory in Central Falls as in other places, but what was different was that it was all ignited by the state takeover of school districts. And so based on that, I thought maybe this is happening elsewhere. And so I collected data for school districts across the country who have experienced takeovers, and of course the case studies here in New Jersey. And I did find that communities that had low levels of political empowerment, meaning that they didn't have much representation at the school board level, city council level at the time of the takeover, that actually the takeover opened up doors for these communities to gain representation. And those who had high levels of political empowerment, like the black community in Newark, were the effects of the takeover had negative consequences for them. But I do want to say something about the Newark experience, which is also part of what led me to want to study Newark. Many people don't know that the first attempt to take over the school district in Newark happened in the 1960s. It happened after the 67 rebellion. And so the report that the governor commissioned at the time in 68 actually proposed to take over the school district to give the black community political empowerment, because at the time of the rebellion they didn't. Obviously that was part of the reason why Newarkers rebelled at the time. And so the state proposed to take over the school district back in 1968 to actually give the black community an opportunity to gain political empowerment. And many black leaders, including Ken Gibson, who would eventually become the first black mayor in the city of Newark, supported this proposal. And so this is consistent with what I find across the board, is that when a community has low levels of political empowerment, like Newark did, the black community did in 1968, or like the Latino community had in the 1990s in Central Falls, they do not view the state takeover as detrimental to their political empowerment, because they didn't have political empowerment. But once a community does have political empowerment, then it has negative consequences for them.
So just to go over that. So hypothetically, had Newark schools been taken over during the time when the African American community was seeking power, before the African American community had power, it potentially would not have been seen as a negative. But at the time that state takeover was actually enacted,
in 1995, it was seen as a negative, because they actually had
it
power
disenfranchised.
to lose.
Yes, absolutely.
And if I could just add one thing to this, and although the data show that in the book I showed that it does have a different effect on communities, I think it's very, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this, I think it's very important to note that most state takeovers, this is not what happened. What happened in Central Falls, where the community that was marginalized eventually becomes empowered, it's not exactly what happens in most places. Actually, it becomes sort of like an outlier. And so what I argue in the book is that, look, Central Falls is an example of where the state could come in and be supportive of a community that's marginalized. Newark in 1968 is an example of the state being potentially being supportive of a community that's marginalized. But what state takeovers eventually become is something completely different.
So let me ask you this, and So the state could have come over could have taken over in 1968 when the African American community was fighting for more empowerment, but it didn't.
It didn't.
Okay. So, and I think, we can talk about this a little now, a little later,
Yeah.
but that leads me to some conclusions, some political conclusions. Why didn't they come in at that time?
Yeah, and so I think that's a good question. So I don't study that particular question that much, but I can kind of speculate based on what eventually happens with state takeovers, and what I argue in the book. I think people need to understand that that education oftentimes is considered. People think about reading, math, and that part of education. What we don't think about often enough is how education is really a political project, and that education has always been intended not only to teach young people how to read and write and do math, but also how to become citizens. And by being a political project, state takeovers, we have to think about them not only just as an education tool, but as a political tool. And so I think that what didn't happen in '68, but did happen in 1995, was a result of political, and I shouldn't say I think, I provide compelling evidence to show this, that it's really about the politics side of education, not simply the math, reading, and arithmetic.
Okay,
part
and
of it.
I
Yeah.
think that's important because I've certainly I lived through everything that you're talking about. I went to school in Newark, so I was in school in Newark, during the, don't want to tell my age, during the late 1950s and 1960s, kind of at the end of the second great migration of African Americans from the South, where Newark, I don't remember the numbers, but the numbers in Newark minimally quadrupled and probably more than that of African Americans, and that there was a school system that was totally unprepared and unwilling to really make the types of adjustments that were needed to truly educate this new populations. Just like in recent years, the school districts have had to review, revamp, and redesign in order to meet the needs of immigrant populations. Well, the same kind of thing, except that there was a big problem with the willingness and I don't want to say capacity, we always have the capacity, but the willingness of the district, I think, at that time to take on that challenge and to see it as one that was worthy of being done. So I lived through that, through everything that you're talking about. So I think it's really important that we have this discussion in a historical and a political context, because so many times when folks talk about the state takeover, they talk about, the board was bad, the superintendent was bad, the district was bad, the kids weren't, it was so horrible. But at the end of the day, so many other districts were and are in so much worse shape than Newark, that there has to be other reasons kind of why this happened. So the historical perspective is so important, and is, as I said, missing from other conversations until your book, until this conversation here. So,
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
So, and this goes back to your original question about why Newark. And so a little bit about that. I came to Newark, started doing my case study here in 2012. So that's the time that you were chairing the school board.
Yes.
And I came to Newark. I'm originally from New Jersey, but not from Newark. But I did all of the research that I needed to do before coming to study Newark. So I read what the Star Ledger had said about the Newark takeover, what the state had said about justifying the state takeover, what other scholars had said about Newark. And there was a consensus that at some level the community here in Newark had failed to provide an adequate education for the students of Newark, and that's the reason why the takeover happened. And so, I write in the book, I arrived to Newark and I'm attending school board meetings, and time after time after time, what I noticed was something that was challenging, was contradicting what was being said about Newark, that this was a community that deeply cared about its school system. I had attended school board meetings, not just in Newark, but in other places in New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and other places, and never saw the type of of participation that I saw in Newark. And so that made me wonder, think about, so maybe the state takeover didn't happen because the community didn't care, but precisely because they cared. And because they cared, they may have set off a series of political struggles. And I think the evidence that I provide suggests that that's what happened, not just in Newark, but across the board. And so one example of this is that, and going back to the point that you're making, back in the 1960s, when the schools were not adequately staffed, they didn't have the resources to educate the children, buildings actually falling apart, and actually there weren't enough seats to educate every black a student in the Newark School District back in the 1960s. It was the community who fought to get the resources that they needed to educate the children in Newark, not just in Newark, but in Jersey City, Camden, and other places, other urban centers in New Jersey. And takeovers, and I think this is one of the major findings in the book, that takeovers only happen in places where communities actually won court cases to gain more resources for the schools. And New Jersey was the first state in the country where this happened. And it's no coincidence then that it becomes the first state in the country to actually pass a law to take over school districts, and then eventually the first state in the country to take over school district in 1989. And so this is an important part of the story.
It makes so much sense. And, you know, when you look at Newark and other school districts in New Jersey were taken over also, but, you know, you say, you talk about in the book how black communities disproportionately experience the most punitive types of actions in state takeovers, and Newark experienced more punitive actions than even the other states in New Jersey. And I look at the activism of people in Newark, and I look at, and it's historic. My parents were involved in Newark, believe it or not, in at that time, efforts to integrate certain schools in the Weequahic section in the South Ward. You know, people in Newark come out. And one thing that's a little bit funny about Newark loves meetings, okay? If there's any, people will be discussing something, and somebody in that group will say, let's have a meeting, okay? Newark is about meetings. And when there's a meeting, people in Newark will go and they will express their opinions, and particularly in education. You know, so I can understand why that dynamic of the people in Newark really being people who will struggle and fight for their rights and for their children. I can see where that could be threatening, you know, particularly to a state and particularly to Republican, you know,
Yeah, and this is
state leaders.
Yeah, and this is where Newark is again very consistent with what we see happening across the country. And so I think it also may be helpful to go back and a little bit more history about how state takeovers emerged to provide a little bit more context for this point that you're making. So, you know, I argue in the book that in the 1960s, as African American communities are gaining political empowerment in cities, you have also a national government led by a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson at the time, and which had adopted a pro-civil rights agenda. So the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and so forth. And so there is, at the national level, an embrace of a civil rights agenda. At the local level, an increase of black political empowerment. And so conservatives, their response was to concentrate political power at the state level. Because they couldn't do it at the national level, and they were increasingly losing it at the local level. And so conservatives, which by the 1960s and 1970s are now an important part of the Republican Party, they begin to consolidate power at the state level. And one of the major issues for the conservative movement at the state level was what was happening with black political leadership in cities. Number one, black political leaders were increasingly were an important part of the Democratic coalition, so there was tension there between Republicans and Democrats. But not only that, as I mentioned already, these communities were fighting for more resources, which meant that they were demanding the state legislatures to provide more resources to these cities, which was also problematic for conservatives. Their response was to consolidate power, and particularly at the school level. So state takeovers were new to American politics until the 1980s. This didn't really happen before. And it's happening because schools school funding was one of the very few areas in all of American politics that by the 1980s was actually increasing. Everything else was decreasing, and so the conservatives they argued that in order to educate these students, predominantly black students, that we need to remove the black political leadership from decision making, and that's what takeovers emerge. And I call this the conservative education logic in the book, to suggest that somehow you can improve education by separating the community. This is Newark has been. Just like as you mentioned, very passionate about saying that there is no way that you know more about educating my kids than we do. I write about that in the book. And so Newark is an example of what other communities will try to do as well, is say that there is no way that you can say to us that you know better for our kids than we do.
Right. I think another thing you discuss in the book that's very interesting is the economic impact on the city when a state comes in and they basically fire a lot of the local people who are working for the district, and we can understand how that would impact families and children within the city. But the ideology behind that is what? What can a real justification be?
Yeah. So it's again, it comes back to this point about education being not just again about the reading, writing, arithmetic, but about the political and economic importance of education for a community. And so education, again, one of the few areas where the funding actually increases in the 1980s, and this funding is going to cities. With predominantly African American communities and other communities of color, and the local leadership is actually getting a chance to make decisions about how these dollars are going to be spent. And so that is a critical part of a community's political and economic development. And so by taking over that, you harm the political empowerment, but you also harm the economic empowerment of a community. And so, again, it's if we think about this in terms of the economic and political importance, not just again math, reading, writing. It kind of starts to make a little bit more sense about why certain communities will be under attack. And so in the case of Newark, like in the case of New Orleans and other places, these communities are devastated by these state takeovers, not only because they lose decision-making power, but they also lose actual jobs, and not just teaching jobs, not just principalships, but cafeteria workers, bus attendants, and so forth, people who just make up kind of like the middle class of a community, and so that is devastated as well.
Right, and the people whose children actually attend the public schools, the public school system.
Exactly.
Okay, conspiracy theory or conspiracy?
I listen. I don't think it's much of a conspiracy theory. I think I lay out the arguments here, and I have compelling evidence, I think, to prove that this is what's happening now.
Absolutely. So the idea, though, and I'm going to play devil's advocate just for a second. Okay, the scores are low, the attendance is low, the dropout rate is high, the graduation rate is low. Obviously, they're not doing their job.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't the state come in?
Yeah. So, what I argue is that there is a place for the state, and the state should be supportive of these localities. All urban school districts across the country have their challenges. And the primary challenge is that the students, the school districts need resources that the city oftentimes can't generate, and therefore it needs outside resources. And this is where the state is supposed to come in and provide these resources. So you can do that and also provide support without saying to these communities, we're going to completely remove you from the process. It's never been proven that you can remove an entire community from decision making, whether at the school board level, the mayor's office, and then have a good outcome. certainly you can make an argument that maybe test scores may improve here and there, but and which is what the people in New Orleans are saying. They're making the same arguments, but at what expense? At the complete removal of a community, a complete economic devastation of a community. So, what is the purpose of education if it's at this expense? And so, what I argue is that there's a different way to do this, and there's haven't been a lot of examples of where this has happened, but there are some examples where the state can come in and say, we're going to support you. We're not going to come and take over. And for school districts that need support, we're going to make sure that we provide even more support, not take over. And one great example that we have here in the state of New Jersey is the Union City School District, right? So the Union City School District is looked at, across the country as a model of education, a high immigrant population and doing well. Well, the Union City School District was on the verge of being taken over back in the 1990s as well, at the same time that Newark was taken over, but they were never taken over. And instead, the state was very supportive of the Union City School District and provided not the contestation that we saw happen in Newark and other places, but the support. And so I think that Union City is a good example of how the state could come in and help and not take over.
There's another part of that story that I think would make another show.
Of course,
I think that, and not to get off subject,
yeah.
I think that some other things happened there that would make another whole show as to why they were successful. And I don't want to get into it now, but that,
You
I
can
think
invite me back, or we
I-
can talk about
I
it now.
will.
Yeah.
No, we can't talk about it now, but I think there were some things that happened within the union that really, and how they dealt with the union issues that might not be so pretty.
So perhaps
Yeah.
the union story is important there, but I think that there's
I'm
another.
I'm saying the trade unions, the teachers union. That's what I'm talking about.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it may be that's a critical role here. But one other thing that happens politically, we have to remember that Union City was the second largest Cuban population in the United States, second to Miami, and Cubans became an important part of the Republican base at the national level and at the state level here in New Jersey, and the Republican administrations did not view this community as an opposition, but instead as a community that we can welcome, as an ally. And by welcoming them, viewing them as citizens, indeed helping them become citizens. And we see the Cuban population become citizens at levels that we generally don't see. They were seen as citizens that deserve the respect and as allies. Newark, the black community in Newark was never seen that way by these administrations, right? So there's something very different there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
So we're going to segue here. I think that it's important, and I just want to move on to talk about that relationship that needs to happen. When we talk about Newark, I think we have to look at the future. We have to figure out how to move forward, not just in the sense of what the school board does and doesn't do and all of those kind of things, but in that kind of historical, political perspective of how we're going to move forward together as a community. How do we take the experiences of the African American community, the experiences of the Latino community, and understand, I believe, that ultimately state takeover, being controlled by someone else, doesn't ultimately benefit anyone, because you're still not, the citizens are not really involved in making decisions. And we've seen how state takeover has really negatively affected at least Newark. So I look at Newark. The leadership in Newark is Democratic. This is a Democratic city. Yet we still have a way to go. We have to figure out how we move together and how we work together, and how, everyone, and I'll just, I'm kind of bottom line person, so, everyone is rightly and justifiably fighting for power for their constituents. Makes perfect sense. You can't be a leader if you're not fighting for, rights and power for your constituents. At the same time, what I found, because I travel around the country, we work with the Community Schools Initiative here in Newark, so we travel around the country and we look at different school districts and what they're doing and how they're advancing. And every single place that we have visited, West Coast, everywhere, the schools that are really making advances in educating their children, dropout rates decreasing, graduation rates increasing, college, graduation increasing, parents involved in the schools and the community. In all of those places, people have actually put their differences aside. Okay, mayors and school superintendents and this one. There comes a point where folks say, these are our children, and we have to sit down together and we have to figure out what's best. And I see it all over the country, and I believe that's what we have. That's what we have to do here. That's what we all have to do here. And I just want to take you back to the last few pages. The last few pages of your book, where you really, and your book is, it is, and it's a academic, but it's an easy read, because I just want to compliment you because it is so well articulated that anyone from an academic to just anyone, any parent, any student, anyone will be able to read it and really get a lot out of it. So then when I look at the last pages of your book, even though your book is research-based, quantitative, qualitative, you do the whole nine for anyone who's really interested in looking at that detail. But at the end of the book, you really talk about what it's going to take. You talk about what Newark has experienced, and then you speak to what it is going to take for us to move forward. And you reference Mayor Baraka. He had a series of events. And right before we were moving out of state takeover, he had a series of events. And he talked about just that, the need for everyone to work collaboratively to move our city forward. He asked the people in the audience at these events to envision what they want their schools to look like. And this was all over the city in all of the wards. And, you know, I got that same feeling when I read your kind of final words. So what were your thoughts? What were your actual feelings when you got to that part? It's kind of a message.
Yeah. So what I think I wanted to really convey at the end of the book is that, number one, there's this history of resistance in the city of Newark. And at the time when I was writing this, it was not a done deal yet, but it seemed like that local control was going to come. And so I really want to reflect on that and to kind of document what it took to get here, kind of reflect on what it took to get to this point, and acknowledge all of the different actors that played a role in getting there. So from the school board to parents to students to the mayor and so forth. But then to try and envision, I was channeling what the mayor had been doing in these series of meetings, where he was trying to build a collective kind of ethos about the city to move it forward. And I don't write about this, but I remember him attending. I attended several of these meetings, and the one he attended at in the South Ward, church basement, majority African American population. I mean, over.
And 90, I think it was snowing that day.
And it was snowing that day.
And it was still packed.
And it was still packed in the basement. And the mayor was talking here in a room, 90 plus percentage African Americans, about the importance of ESL. English language learning education, because this was critical for the entire school district. And so here, I found, perhaps interesting is not the right word, but he didn't have to do that.
That's
right. He could have said what needed to say in the North Ward. He could have said what he needed to say in the East Ward. He could have said what he needed to say in the South Ward.
He could have tailored his remarks to his audience.
Audience, but he didn't do that.
That's right.
And so, and as the mayor, he's uniquely situated to try to bring the community together in that way. And so I think that's an example of a mayor who's actually trying to do that. But it's going to take a lot more than the mayor, of course. And so I think that the great thing about the city of Newark as well, and so I try to reflect on this at the end of the book as well, is about the role of the students and the role that they played to eventually they eventually led to the return of local control. And so I think that the students also provide a model for how to bring the city together. And so I think that's going to be critical. If the two largest groups in the city of Newark, African Americans and Latinos, if there was more unity back in 1995, I'm not saying that the takeover wouldn't have happened, but it would have been a lot harder, because these divisions that existed at the time between communities, if they didn't exist, it would have made it more difficult for the state to come in. And so going forward, there needs to be that type of coalition building between all of the wards, all of the communities in the city of Newark to move it forward. And by doing so, they can fight off any type of intervention that is hostile, but they can also invite the type of intervention that they want collectively.
Right.
And so I think that the city of Newark, certainly we see the signs of this. We see it from the students, we see it from the mayor, and so I think that it's we see a positive sign that is heading in that direction.
That's right.
Yeah.
Always stronger together, right?
Always.
Always.
Absolutely. And the last thing I think about this is about as well, that I think we really need to reflect on too, is that the role of the state and the role of the citizens of the state of New Jersey. I don't think that we have fully grappled with really the reason for the state takeover of the schools. I mean, I try to argue in this book that the takeover was not because Newarkers didn't care.
Right.
It was because Newarkers didn't have the resources and fought for those resources, right? And were demanding that their citizenship be recognized. And if we grapple it with it in that way, I think we could have a conversation as a state about, number one, providing the resources that our kids need in a city like Newark, in a city like Jersey City and other places. But that also shouldn't come at the expense of the community being kind of removed from the process. That we need to acknowledge that local people, mayor, city council, school board, community groups, that they deserve a say in their children's education. Absolutely. And so we need to grapple with that as well. And so at the state level and at the city level, we need to have these types of conversations.
We do. And I think, when we talk about equity, I think that all school districts need to be looked at through the same lens. And I think if that happens, that there'd be more of a balance in terms of how districts are treated. Because if you look at Newark, as I said before, not to justify anything, but certainly no worse than many other places that just don't get the sort of negative attention that Newark has gotten. So I want to thank you so very much. Right now, though, before we close out, I'm going to go back. One question.
Sure.
Where can viewers get your book?
So you can get the book on Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, Oxford, the Oxford University Press website. You can get it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy by Dr. Domingo Morel. This is a must-read. Really, 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 really important book, and a book that comes from a professor right here at Newark Rutgers. And we're so glad that you are here at Newark Rutgers. I'm going to go back now to the answer to our fun fact. And the question was this. In 1995, when the state took over the Newark School District, it disbanded the Newark Board of Education and appointed a 15-member advisory board. How long did the advisory board remain appointed and not elected? So let me just do this disclaimer. I got the answer from Domingo's book. So if it's wrong, it's his fault. And the answer is 5 years. The first advisory board election took place in 2000. Am I correct?
Yeah, was it between 2000 and 2002? I can't remember.
I'm just going by what. Okay, well,
Between
we'll
2000 and 2002.
We'll
Yeah,
check on
yeah,
that.
between that period of
All
time.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll check
Yeah.
on that. But
Yeah.
the point is that when the school district was taken over by the state, the school board was disbanded. A board was then selected or appointed, and it remained that way for 5 to 7 years before the voters began to vote again. Even then, it was for an advisory board, but the people were voting and choosing those people again, and we still have an elected school board. So I want to thank you again.
Thank you.
On behalf of Mayor Raz J. Baraka, I thank you for supporting EduTalk, and I thank all of you out there who are watching for supporting EduTalk. We hope you learned something today. I did, and I hope most of all that EduTalk has been both stimulating and enjoyable, and we understand that today it was a bit controversial. See you next time.